The wind was a blade against his skin, honed sharp by 1,000 miles of unbroken white. Elias leaned into it, his shoulders a bulwark against the fury of the storm. Each breath was a shard of ice in his lungs. The world had vanished, erased by a maelstrom of snow that churned sky and earth into a single, roaring void. He was checking the west fence line, a fool's errand in this blizzard, but the stillness of the cabin had become a tomb, and the ghosts whispered loudest in the quiet. He found them near the cottonwood grove, a dark knot against the blinding snow. At first, he thought it was a fallen deer, but then the knot shifted, a small, desperate movement. He moved closer, his rifle held low. It was a woman, curled into a failing ball of warmth around a small child. Her hair, the color of dead leaves, was matted with ice. Her face was a pale, blue-tinged mask. The boy was tucked against her chest, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The woman's lips moved, but the wind tore the sound away. Elias knelt, his own past rushing up to choke him. Another winter, another child, another stillness that was not sleep. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, a lifetime of grief passing through him. Then he unslung his rifle, hooked it over his shoulder, and gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. "Get the boy," he rasped, his voice raw. The woman's eyes, a faded, exhausted blue, fluttered open. She tried to hold on to the child, a primal instinct fighting through the frost. "I have him," Elias said, his voice a low command meant to soothe an animal. He scooped the small, stiff body into his other arm and turned his back to the wind, a slow, lumbering beast carrying a fragile burden back toward the distant smudge of smoke that was his home. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth was the cabin's beating heart. It threw dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls as Elias laid them on the bearskin rug. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, stripping away their frozen, threadbare coats. The woman flinched when his rough hands touched her, a tremor of fear that had nothing to do with the cold. The boy was rigid, his small frame a statue of terror. Elias ignored their fear, focusing on the task. He wrapped them in thick wool blankets, his own, smelling of wood smoke and solitude. He ladled broth from the pot over the fire into 2 bowls. He set one beside the woman, then knelt before the boy. The child's eyes followed his every move, dark and bottomless. Elias held the spoon to his lips. The boy did not open them. He tried again. Nothing. The woman stirred, pushing herself up on one elbow. Her voice was a dry crackle. "He won't." Elias looked at her. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over fine bones, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. It was the first sign of life he'd seen. He set the boy's bowl down and pushed the other one closer to her. "You then," he said. It was not a request. She ate, her movements stiff and clumsy at first, then ravenous, her gaze never leaving the child. When she was done, she took the boy's bowl and held the spoon to his lips, murmuring something soft and low, a sound lost beneath the howl of the storm outside. The boy's mouth opened. He took the broth. Elias watched them from the shadows, a silent observer in his own home. He felt like an intruder. He had not shared this space with another living soul in 5 years. The ghosts were quiet now, pushed back by the startling, uncomfortable reality of a woman and a child by his fire. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the snow-caked window. The storm did not relent. It locked them in, 3 strangers bound by a shared, unspoken dread of what lay beyond the walls. Her name was Lena. The boy was Samuel. She offered the names like a careful currency, a small payment for the shelter he provided. She said little else. The boy said nothing at all. He was a silent shadow, always at his mother's side, his eyes holding a permanent state of alarm. Elias learned their rhythms. Lena would rise before him, stoking the embers of the fire back to life. She moved with a quiet competence, mending a tear in Samuel's worn shirt with a needle and thread she produced from a small pouch, her hands deft and sure. She cooked, turning his meager supplies of flour and salted pork into meals that were more than just sustenance. She was claiming a small corner of his world, making it habitable, and he found himself letting her. He watched her hands, the way they never rested, always finding a task. He watched the way she spoke to Samuel, not with words but with touches, with the gentle pressure of her hand on his back, a silent language of reassurance. One afternoon, Elias sat at his small table, carving a piece of pine wood. The shavings fell in fragrant curls to the floor. He worked the knife with practiced ease, his scarred hands transforming the block into the rough shape of a horse. He remembered carving one for his own boy, a lifetime ago. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb. He left the finished horse on the floor near where Samuel sat huddled by the fire. He said nothing, just got up and went to split more wood. When he returned, the cabin thick with the smell of fresh snow and pine, the horse was gone. He saw it later, clutched in Samuel's small hand as Lena rocked him to sleep. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with questions that hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. He wanted to ask where she had come from, who she was running from with a terror so deep it had stolen her son's voice. She wanted to ask about the sadness that clung to him like his wood smoke-scented coat, about the woman's faded dress hanging on a peg by the door, a relic he never touched but could not bring himself to put away. They spoke instead of practical things. The depth of the snow, the remaining firewood, the dwindling flour. "The storm will break soon," he said one evening, looking out the window at the relentless white. Lena was kneading dough on a floured board. She did not look up, but her hands stilled. "Yes," she whispered. The word was heavy with fear. In the quiet that followed, the threat felt more real than the howling wind. It was in the cabin with them, a fourth presence. Later that night, he woke to a small sound. Lena was weeping, silent, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. She had curled herself around Samuel, trying to muffle the sounds of her despair. Elias lay on his cot, listening, the sound of physical blow. He felt the chasm of his own grief open up, a raw and familiar wound. He wanted to offer a word of comfort, but the words had died in him years ago. Instead, he got up, added another log to the fire, and sat in his chair, a sentinel in the dark. He did not go back to bed. He stayed there until the first gray light of dawn, watching over them, a silent promise he hadn't realized he was making. The next day, he took his rifle down from the wall. Lena's breath hitched. "I'm checking the snares," he said, his voice flat. "Stay inside. Bolt the door." Her eyes were wide with a question she would not ask. He saw it anyway. Was he leaving them? He met her gaze. "Bolt the door," he repeated. And this time there was something else in his voice, a rough edge of reassurance. He left, and the world outside was a revelation. The wind had died. The snow had stopped. A profound, pristine silence had fallen over the landscape. The sun was a weak disk behind a thin veil of cloud, but its light was blinding on the new snow. He worked his way through the drifts, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest. The beauty of it was an offense. It felt wrong that the world could be this peaceful when he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the peace was a lie. He found rabbit in 2 of the snares and turned for home. As he crested the ridge overlooking the cabin, he saw it. A single rider, a black shape moving slowly against the white. The man was following the faint trail Elias had broken. He was coming for the cabin. Elias's training, the instincts honed in the blood and mud of Shiloh, took over. He dropped to one knee behind a snow-dusted pine, the cold of the rifle stock seeping into his hand. He watched the man approach. He was large, broad-shouldered, riding with an air of arrogant ownership. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin, dismounted, and strode toward the door. Elias raised the rifle, the man's head clear in his sights. He could end it now. One clean shot. But he waited. He had seen enough killing. He would not start it. Not unless he had to. Inside, Lena had seen him too. She stood frozen by the window, her hand pressed to her mouth, her knuckles white. Samuel was behind her, his small hands clutching her dress. The heavy thud of a fist on the door made them both jump. "Lena!" The voice was coarse, confident. It was a voice used to being obeyed. "I know you're in there. I saw the smoke. Open this door." Lena backed away from the door as if it were on fire, pulling Samuel with her. "That's Silas," she breathed, the name a venomous whisper. "My husband's brother." The pounding came again, louder this time, rattling the heavy wood in its frame. "Don't make me break it down, girl. You and that boy belong to me now. The farm, the boy, all of it. It's the law." Lena's face was a mask of terror, but as she looked down at Samuel, something shifted. The fear was still there, but it was joined by a cold, hard fury. She backed them into the corner farthest from the door, near the hearth, and picked up the heavy iron poker. Her hands trembled, but her grip was tight. The wood of the door groaned, then splintered as a heavy boot slammed against it. Once, twice. On the third kick, the bolt tore from the frame and the door flew open. Silas filled the doorway, blocking the light. He was smiling, a cruel, satisfied twist of his lips. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Lena and the boy. "There you are," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive growl. He took a step inside. "We're going home." A voice from behind him, cold and quiet as the snow, stopped him. "No, you're not." Silas turned slowly. Elias stood there, just outside the door, his rifle held loosely at his side. He looked calm, almost placid, but there was a stillness about him that was more dangerous than any shout. "Who the hell are you?" Silas sneered. "This is family business. This is my home," Elias said, his voice level. "And she is my guest. You'll leave." Silas laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I'm not leaving without what's mine." He took a step toward Elias, his hand dropping to the pistol holstered at his hip. "The woman and the boy are coming with me." Elias didn't move. He just watched the man's hand. "Her husband died." Lena's voice, tight with hate, cut through the tension. Silas said we were his now. His property." Elias's gaze shifted to Lena, then to the boy hiding behind her. He saw the specter of his own wife, his own son, taken from him by a force he couldn't fight. But this was a force he could. "Last chance," Elias said, his eyes locking back onto Silas. "Ride out." Silas's smile vanished, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can stop me?" He drew his pistol. The movement was a blur, but Elias was faster. He wasn't drawing. He was already there. He swung the butt of his rifle in a short, brutal arc. The heavy wood connected with Silas's wrist with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from his numb fingers, landing in the snow. Silas roared in pain and lunged, his good hand reaching for Elias's throat. They crashed together, two forces of will. Elias was leaner, but he had a wiry strength forged in hardship. Silas was pure brute force. They stumbled into the cabin, knocking over the small table. Elias drove his shoulder into the bigger man's chest, sending him staggering back against the wall. Silas grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the hearth and swung it wildly. Elias ducked, the pan whistling past his head and smashing into the log wall. He moved inside the man's reach, driving his fists into his stomach. Hard, sharp punches like he was splitting logs. Silas grunted, the air leaving his lungs. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with pained surprise. He tripped over the bearskin rug and fell heavily, his head striking the stone hearth with a hollow thud. He lay still. Silence descended, absolute and deafening. The only sound was the ragged gasps of Elias's breath and the soft crackle of the fire. Lena stood frozen, the poker still clutched in her hand. Samuel peeked out from behind her, his eyes fixed on the unmoving man on the floor. Elias walked over and knelt, his fingers pressing against Silas's neck. He felt nothing. He looked up at Lena. His face was grim, a cut bleeding freely above his eye. "It's done," he said. The words seemed to release her. The poker clattered to the floor. She sank down, pulling Samuel into her lap and burying her face in his hair. Her body shook with the violent tremors of release. Elias watched them for a long moment, the man on the floor forgotten. He saw not two strangers, but the shape of a family, a fragile thing he thought he had lost forever. He went outside into the cold, clean air and was sick in the snow. He spent the rest of the day in a grim state of purpose. He wrapped the body in a canvas tarp and dragged it to the old barn, a place he hadn't entered in years. He would deal with it when the ground thawed. When he returned to the cabin, the floor was clean. Lena was sitting by the fire, stitching the gash on his forehead with the same needle and thread she had used on her son's shirt. Her touch was gentle, her fingers surprisingly steady. Samuel sat beside them, the small wooden horse in his hand. He wasn't looking at his mother or at Elias. He was looking at the fire, at the flames dancing and twisting. He reached out a small hand, not to the fire, but toward Elias. He laid his hand on Elias's knee. It was a small, light touch, but it felt like an anchor. Elias looked down at the boy, then at Lena. Her eyes met his, and in their depths, he saw not gratitude, but a shared understanding. They were both survivors. They were both scarred. Elias, the boy said. The word was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but it was clear as a bell. It was the first word he had spoken. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. Elias looked at the boy, then back at Lena. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. It was not joy, not yet. It was something quieter, more fragile. It was hope. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the endless snow in hues of pink and gold. The storm was over. The world was quiet. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin did not feel empty. Felt like home.